In the chaos of war, when bullets fly and death lurks around every corner, heroes are not born from textbooks or training manuals. They emerge from split-second decisions that define the difference between life and death, between abandoning your brothers in arms or risking everything to bring them home. This is the story of one woman who faced an impossible choice when 280 Marines found themselves trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded by hostile forces with no way out. What happened next would challenge every military protocol, defy every order, and prove that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism require breaking all the rules. In the heat of battle, she would discover that being a medic meant more than healing wounds. It meant having the courage to cross lines that others wouldn't dare approach, even when it meant putting her own life on the line for soldiers she had sworn to protect. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of Afghanistan. As Corporal Sarah Mitchell adjusted her medical pack one final time, the weight felt familiar on her shoulders, every piece of equipment precisely placed where muscle memory could find it in the dark. At 26, she had already served 3 tours in this unforgiving landscape, but something about today felt different. The air carried an electric tension that made the hair on her arms stand up, and the usual chatter among the Marines had been replaced by focused silence. Captain Rodriguez gathered the company around a makeshift briefing area, using his knee to smooth out a wrinkled map against a large boulder. 280 Marines from Bravo Company had been tasked with securing a strategic mountain pass that intelligence reports suggested was being used as a supply route for insurgent forces. The mission seemed straightforward enough. Establish a perimeter, search for weapons caches, and maintain control of the area for 72 hours, until reinforcements could arrive to establish a permanent outpost. Sarah studied the faces around her as the captain outlined their objectives. These weren't green recruits fresh from boot camp. Most of these men had been through hell together, forming bonds that went beyond ordinary friendship. There was Johnson, the 19-year-old from Detroit who kept a picture of his newborn daughter taped inside his helmet. Martinez, the squad leader from Texas who could make anyone laugh even during the worst moments. Thompson, the machine gunner who had saved half the company during their last engagement by holding off enemy forces while his team evacuated wounded soldiers. The plan was methodical and seemed solid. 3 platoons would approach from different angles, with 1st Platoon taking the high ground on the eastern ridge, 2nd Platoon securing the main pass through the center, and 3rd Platoon establishing overwatch positions on the western slopes. Sarah would move with 2nd Platoon, positioned centrally where she could respond quickly to casualties from any direction. Radio communication would be maintained every 30 minutes, and extraction helicopters would remain on standby at the forward operating base 40 miles south. As they moved out in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt the familiar rhythm of a combat patrol settling over the group. Boots moved carefully across loose rocks, weapons remained at the ready, and every Marine maintained proper spacing to minimize casualties from potential ambushes. The terrain was challenging, with steep inclines and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent cover for both friendly and hostile forces. Sarah found herself breathing hard as they climbed, the thin mountain air combining with the weight of her equipment to test her endurance. The first sign of trouble came 3 hours into the mission. Sergeant Williams, leading the point element, raised his fist in the air, bringing the entire column to an immediate halt. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see him studying something in the distance, his body language tense and alert. After several minutes, he motioned for the company commander to move forward, and the 2 men engaged in a whispered conversation that lasted longer than anyone felt comfortable with. When Captain Rodriguez returned to the main group, his expression had changed completely. The confident demeanor from the morning briefing had been replaced by something much more serious. He gathered his platoon leaders and key personnel, including Sarah as the senior medic, for an emergency consultation. What they had discovered ahead was not the simple supply route they had expected to find. Instead, intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The mountain pass was heavily fortified, with prepared fighting positions, multiple weapon emplacements, and clear evidence of a much larger enemy presence than anyone had anticipated. The smart move would have been to withdraw immediately and call for additional support, but retreat was no longer a simple option. 1st Platoon, which had moved to secure the eastern ridge, had already reported contact with enemy forces and was requesting immediate assistance. Their radio transmissions were broken and filled with the sounds of intense gunfire. 3rd Platoon, positioned on the western slopes, had gone completely silent after reporting movement in their sector 20 minutes earlier. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the gravity of their situation became clear. 2nd Platoon, with just under 90 Marines, was now the only element with confirmed communication and freedom of movement. The other 190 Marines were either engaged in active combat or potentially overrun completely. Making matters worse, The terrain that had seemed like an advantage during the approach was now working against them. The rocky slopes and narrow passages that provided excellent defensive positions also created natural kill zones where enemy forces could concentrate their fire. Captain Rodriguez made the decision that would define the next 72 hours. Rather than attempting to withdraw and potentially abandoning Marines who might still be fighting for their lives, Bravo Company would advance and attempt to link up with their separated elements. It was a calculated risk based on limited information, but the alternative, leaving fellow Marines behind, was simply not acceptable to anyone in the unit. As 2nd Platoon began moving toward the last known position of 1st Platoon, Sarah checked her medical supplies one more time. Her combat lifesaver bag contained enough equipment to treat major trauma injuries for approximately 20 casualties, assuming standard battlefield wounds. She also carried additional morphine, antibiotics, and emergency surgical supplies that could extend her capability in prolonged engagements. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her as she realized that the lives of nearly 300 Marines might depend on her ability to keep wounded soldiers alive long enough for evacuation. The approach to 1st Platoon's position took nearly 2 hours of careful movement through increasingly dangerous terrain. Enemy sniper fire began at the 1-hour mark, forcing the Marines to move in short rushes between available cover. Sarah found herself treating her first casualty of the day when Private Peterson took a bullet through his shoulder while crossing an exposed section of trail. The wound was serious, but manageable, and she was able to stabilize him quickly before he was evacuated back down the mountain with 2 other Marines as escort. When 2nd Platoon finally reached the Eastern Ridge, what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. 1st Platoon had been pinned down in a defensive position for over 3 hours, surrounded by enemy forces on 3 sides. 12 Marines had been wounded, including the platoon commander, and ammunition was running critically low. The enemy had positioned machine gun nests and mortar teams in overlapping fields of fire that made any movement extremely dangerous. Sarah immediately went to work on the wounded, moving from position to position under cover of suppressive fire from her fellow Marines. The injuries ranged from minor shrapnel wounds to severe trauma that required immediate surgery. One Marine had taken shrapnel to his abdomen and was bleeding internally. Another had been shot through the leg, severing his femoral artery. A third had suffered a head injury from a mortar blast and was slipping in and out of consciousness. Working with limited supplies and under constant enemy fire, Sarah performed what amounted to battlefield surgery using equipment that was designed for basic trauma care. She managed to stabilize the Marine with internal bleeding using pressure bandages and emergency blood clotting agents. The leg wound required her to perform an emergency tourniquet application and vascular repair using techniques she had learned in advanced combat medical training but had never been forced to use under such extreme conditions. As darkness began to fall on the first day, the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. Radio contact with 3rd Platoon remained completely lost, and attempts to reach them by sending scout teams had been unsuccessful. Enemy forces appeared to be reinforcing their positions rather than withdrawing, suggesting that Bravo Company had stumbled into a much larger operation than a simple supply route. Intelligence reports from drone surveillance indicated that additional enemy fighters were moving into the area, potentially increasing the hostile force strength to several hundred combatants. Captain Rodriguez called together his remaining leadership for a situation assessment that painted a grim picture. Bravo Company now controlled 2 defensive positions on the Eastern Ridge, but remained cut off from higher headquarters and unable to link up with 3rd Platoon. Medical supplies were already running low after treating 14 casualties, and ammunition consumption was higher than planned due to the intensity of enemy contact. Most critically, the planned extraction by helicopter was no longer possible due to enemy air defense capabilities that had not been anticipated in the original intelligence assessment. Sarah found herself facing a reality that her medical training had prepared her for, intellectually, but never emotionally. She was responsible for keeping wounded Marines alive in a situation where standard evacuation procedures were impossible. The nearest medical facility was over 100 miles away, accessible only by helicopter or a multi-day journey through hostile territory. Her supplies would last perhaps another day if casualty rates remained constant, but any increase in fighting intensity would quickly exhaust her ability to provide effective medical care. The night brought little relief from enemy harassment. Mortar rounds landed sporadically around both defensive positions, and sniper fire continued whenever Marines attempted to move between positions. Sarah used the darkness to move between wounded Marines, checking on their condition and adjusting treatments as needed. The Marine with the head injury had stabilized but remained unconscious. The abdominal wound was holding, but she knew that without proper surgical intervention within the next 24 hours, infection would likely set in. As she worked through the night, Sarah began to understand that their situation was rapidly moving beyond a standard combat engagement. The enemy appeared to have anticipated their arrival and prepared an elaborate trap designed to isolate and destroy the entire company. The terrain that had seemed advantageous was now working completely in favor of the hostile forces, who demonstrated intimate knowledge of every trail, ridgeline, and defensive position in the area. By dawn of the second day, the reality of their situation was undeniable. Bravo Company was surrounded, cut off from support, and facing an enemy force of unknown size that showed no indication of withdrawing. Medical supplies were running critically low, ammunition was being rationed, and several of the wounded Marines required medical attention that was beyond Sarah's ability to provide with field equipment. The decision that would define everything that followed was beginning to crystallize in her mind, though she had not yet found the courage to voice it aloud. The second day brought a crushing realization that shattered any remaining hope for a quick resolution. As Sarah moved between the wounded Marines at first light, checking vital signs and changing bandages with increasingly precious supplies, the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance sent everyone's spirits soaring for exactly 30 seconds. The aircraft appeared on the horizon, flying low and fast toward their position. But before anyone could even attempt radio contact, shoulder-fired missiles streaked up from hidden enemy positions. The helicopter exploded in a ball of orange flame, spinning out of control before crashing into a rocky ravine 2 miles away. Captain Rodriguez closed his eyes for a long moment after witnessing the destruction of what had been their last realistic hope for immediate evacuation. The enemy had clearly prepared anti-aircraft capabilities specifically to prevent helicopter operations in the area. Any future rescue attempts would require significant military assets to suppress air defense systems, and such an operation could take days to organize and execute. For the wounded Marines who needed immediate medical attention, days might as well be years. Sarah felt the weight of impossible decisions settling on her shoulders as she returned to treating casualties. Private Johnson, the young Marine from Detroit with the newborn daughter, had developed signs of infection in his leg wound despite her best efforts to keep it clean. His fever was rising, and without antibiotics, stronger than what she carried in her field supplies, the infection would likely spread to his bloodstream within hours. Corporal Martinez, the squad leader from Texas who had been everyone's source of morale, lay unconscious from a severe concussion sustained during a mortar attack. His breathing had become irregular, suggesting increased pressure on his brain that required immediate surgical intervention. The tactical situation was deteriorating just as rapidly as the medical emergency. 3rd Platoon remained completely missing, with no radio contact for over 24 hours. Scout teams sent to locate them had been driven back by heavy enemy fire, and the terrain made any large-scale movement extremely dangerous. 1st and 2nd platoons, now combined into a single defensive perimeter, controlled approximately 200 yards of rocky ridge line that provided good defensive positions but limited options for maneuver. Enemy forces had spent the night reinforcing their positions and appeared to be preparing for a major assault designed to overrun the Marine positions entirely. Intelligence gathered from captured enemy equipment suggested that the hostile force now numbered over 400 fighters, organized into multiple squads with heavy weapons, mortars, and sophisticated communication equipment. Rather than the loosely organized insurgent group that intelligence had predicted, Bravo Company faced what appeared to be a well-trained military unit with extensive knowledge of the local terrain. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of being the senior medical authority for nearly 200 Marines, while knowing that her ability to provide effective treatment was rapidly approaching its limits. Her medical supplies, designed to support a company-sized unit for 3 days during normal operations, had been stretched beyond capacity by the intensity of combat and the inability to evacuate serious casualties. She had already performed medical procedures that exceeded her training and authorization, making life and death decisions that should have been made by surgeons in well-equipped hospitals. The breaking point came during the afternoon of the second day, when a coordinated enemy attack resulted in 8 additional casualties within a 30-minute period. Sarah worked frantically to triage the wounded, moving from one Marine to another while mortar rounds exploded around the defensive positions. One Marine had taken multiple gunshot wounds to his chest and was bleeding massively from internal injuries. Another had lost his left arm to an improvised explosive device and was going into shock from blood loss. A third had suffered severe burns from a white phosphorus round and was screaming in agony despite the morphine she had administered. Working with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline, Sarah made decisions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. She performed an emergency amputation using combat medical equipment, removing damaged tissue from a Marine's leg to prevent gangrene from spreading to the rest of his body. She conducted emergency surgery on a chest wound, using her combat knife sterilized over a small fire to remove a bullet fragment that was threatening to puncture the Marine's heart. Each procedure pushed her far beyond the scope of her medical training, but the alternative was to watch Marines die from treatable injuries. Captain Rodriguez found her working on the burnt Marine, applying improvised skin grafts made from sterile bandages soaked in antibiotic solution. The captain's face was grim as he knelt beside her, speaking in low tones that wouldn't be overheard by the wounded Marines surrounding them. The situation had moved beyond desperate and was approaching catastrophic. Enemy forces were massing for what appeared to be a final assault that would begin within hours. Ammunition reserves were critically low, with most Marines down to their last few magazines. The conversation that followed would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. Captain Rodriguez explained that he had been in contact with higher headquarters through emergency radio frequencies, and a rescue operation was being planned. However, the earliest that significant military assets could be deployed to break through enemy defenses was 72 hours. The wounded Marines under Sarah's care would not survive another 3 days without proper medical attention and supplies that she simply did not possess. There was, however, one possibility that violated every regulation, protocol, and order that Sarah had ever received during her military career. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces maintained a field hospital approximately 5 miles from their current position, established to treat their own casualties from the ongoing engagement. The facility was lightly defended and contained medical supplies that could potentially keep the wounded Marines alive until proper evacuation became possible. The plan that Captain Rodriguez outlined was essentially a suicide mission disguised as a medical operation. Sarah would leave the defensive perimeter alone, carrying minimal equipment to maximize her speed and stealth. She would infiltrate the enemy field hospital, acquire as many medical supplies as possible, and return to treat the wounded Marines. The chances of success were minimal, and capture would likely result in torture and execution. Even if she succeeded in reaching the enemy facility, there was no guarantee that she could acquire the supplies needed or return safely through territory crawling with hostile forces. Sarah looked around at the Marines she had been treating, seeing faces that had become intimately familiar over the past 2 days. Johnson, still fighting the infection that was slowly poisoning his system. Martinez, whose irregular breathing indicated that time was running out to address his brain injury. Thompson, the machine gunner, who had taken shrapnel to his abdomen and was bleeding internally despite her best efforts to control the hemorrhage. Each face represented someone's son, brother, husband, or father. Each face belonged to a Marine who had trusted her to keep them alive when everything else had gone wrong. The decision that Sarah made in that moment went against every piece of military training she had ever received. Military medical personnel were strictly forbidden from engaging in offensive operations or putting themselves at unnecessary risk. Her primary responsibility was to remain with her unit and provide medical care to the best of her ability with available resources. Leaving her post to conduct what amounted to a robbery of enemy medical supplies was not only unauthorized but could be considered desertion in the face of the enemy. But Sarah had spent 2 days watching Marines suffer from injuries that were completely treatable under normal circumstances. She had performed emergency surgery with inadequate equipment while listening to wounded soldiers call out for their mothers and wives. She had held the hands of dying Marines and promised them that help was coming, knowing that she might be lying to them in their final moments. The weight of those promises and the responsibility she felt for every Marine under her care made the decision inevitable, even though she knew it would likely cost her everything. As darkness fell on the second night, Sarah began preparing for a mission that existed in direct violation of every order she had ever received. She stripped down her equipment to the absolute essentials, carrying only her sidearm, a combat knife, emergency medical supplies, and enough water for 12 hours. Her plan was to move during the hours between midnight and dawn, using darkness to avoid enemy patrols while navigating toward the reported location of the field hospital. Captain Rodriguez provided her with the latest intelligence on enemy positions and patrol patterns, along with a hand-drawn map based on drone surveillance from earlier in the day. The route would take her through territory that was actively patrolled by enemy forces, across 2 ridgelines that offered minimal cover, and through a valley where hostile forces had established multiple checkpoints. The total distance was approximately 5 miles, but the terrain would require nearly 6 hours of careful movement to avoid detection. Sarah spent the final hours before departure moving among the wounded Marines, checking their conditions one last time and making adjustments to their treatment plans. She provided detailed instructions to Corman Williams, the junior medic who would be responsible for their care during her absence. The instructions were necessarily limited by the remaining supplies, but she emphasized the critical importance of monitoring specific Marines whose conditions could deteriorate rapidly without intervention. The conversation with Johnson, the young Marine from Detroit, proved to be one of the most difficult moments of Sarah's entire military career. His infection had worsened throughout the day, and his fever indicated that systemic sepsis was beginning to develop. Without powerful antibiotics, he would likely die within 24 hours. Sarah found herself unable to explain where she was going or why she might not be there when he woke up, so she simply held his hand and told him that she was going to find help. Martinez remained unconscious, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as pressure continued to build inside his skull. Sarah knew that he needed immediate neurosurgery to relieve the pressure, but such an operation was far beyond anything that could be attempted with field medical equipment. Her hope was that enemy medical supplies might include drugs that could reduce brain swelling and buy him additional time until proper evacuation became possible. As midnight approached, Sarah made her final preparations for a mission that would either save the lives of 22 wounded Marines or result in her death or capture behind enemy lines. She had written letters to her family and left them with Captain Rodriguez, along with instructions for the distribution of her personal effects. She had also prepared detailed medical notes on each wounded Marine, documenting their injuries, treatments provided, and recommended follow-up care for whoever might replace her if she failed to return. The last thing Sarah saw before slipping into the darkness was the face of Corporal Thompson, the machine gunner who had saved half the company during their previous engagement. He was awake despite the pain medication, and his eyes met hers as she prepared to leave the defensive perimeter. Without speaking, he reached out and squeezed her hand, a gesture that contained all the gratitude, respect, and understanding that words could never adequately express. In that moment, Sarah knew that regardless of what happened during the next few hours, she was making the only choice that she could live with as a Marine and as a human being. Sarah slipped away from the defensive perimeter at exactly midnight, moving with the careful precision of someone whose life depended on absolute silence. Every step was calculated to avoid loose rocks that might betray her position, every breath controlled to minimize sound in the thin mountain air. The darkness was both her greatest ally and her most dangerous enemy, providing concealment from hostile forces while making navigation through treacherous terrain a constant challenge. The first hour of movement took her through territory that Bravo Company had crossed during their initial advance 2 days earlier, but everything looked different in the darkness. Rock formations that had seemed familiar in daylight became anonymous obstacles, and trails that had been clearly marked during the day disappeared into shadows. Sarah navigated using a combination of compass headings and memorized landmarks, stopping frequently to check her position against the hand-drawn map that Captain Rodriguez had provided. Enemy activity was heavier than intelligence reports had suggested. Within the first 2 hours, Sarah was forced to take cover, 3 times as hostile patrols moved through areas she needed to cross. The first encounter came as she was descending into a narrow ravine that provided the only covered approach to the first ridgeline. Voices speaking in the local dialect echoed off the rocky walls, and Sarah pressed herself against a boulder while 6 armed fighters passed within 10 feet of her hiding position. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she counted their footsteps, not daring to breathe until the sounds faded completely into the distance. The second ridgeline proved to be the most challenging obstacle of the entire journey. The slope was steep and exposed, offering minimal cover from observation or fire. Enemy forces had positioned sentries at regular intervals along the crest, and their patrol patterns created brief windows of opportunity that lasted no more than 15 minutes each. Sarah waited in a rocky outcropping for nearly an hour, timing the movements of the guards and calculating the exact route that would allow her to cross without being detected. When her moment came, Sarah moved with speed and precision that surprised even herself. She covered the 200 yards of open ground in less than 10 minutes, staying low and using every available piece of cover to mask her movement. Her military training had prepared her for this type of infiltration, but the reality of moving alone through enemy territory while carrying the weight of 22 wounded Marines on her conscience added an intensity that no training exercise could replicate. The descent from the second ridgeline brought Sarah into the valley, where intelligence reports indicated the enemy field hospital was located. The facility was larger than she had expected, consisting of several connected structures that appeared to be a combination of permanent buildings and temporary medical tents. Security was lighter than she had feared, with only 2 guards visible at the main entrance and no obvious perimeter patrols. The layout suggested that enemy forces felt secure enough in their control of the area to focus their defensive efforts on the approaches rather than close protection of medical facilities. Sarah spent 40 minutes conducting surveillance of the target, identifying guard positions, noting the locations of medical supplies, and planning both her approach route and multiple escape paths. The main medical tent appeared to contain the bulk of surgical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies, but accessing it would require passing directly through the compound's central area. A smaller tent on the perimeter housed what appeared to be basic medical supplies and might be accessible with less risk of detection. The decision to target the main medical facility rather than the safer peripheral option was driven by the critical condition of the Marines she had left behind. Johnson's infection required powerful antibiotics that were unlikely to be stored in a basic supply tent. Martinez's brain injury needed specialized drugs that would only be available in a fully equipped medical facility. Thompson's internal bleeding required surgical supplies that could only be found in an operating room environment. Sarah's infiltration of the enemy compound began at 4 in the morning, during the period when human alertness naturally reaches its lowest point. She approached from the rear, using a dry creek bed to mask her movement, until she reached the perimeter of the facility. The guards appeared to be fighting fatigue, and their attention was focused outward, toward potential threats, rather than inward toward the medical areas they were protecting. The main medical tent was exactly what Sarah had hoped to find. It contained a complete field surgical suite with equipment that surpassed anything she had seen in most American military medical facilities. Pharmaceutical supplies were organized in clearly labeled storage areas, with antibiotics, pain medications, and surgical drugs available in quantities that could support extended operations. Most importantly, she found the specialized medications needed to treat traumatic brain injury and the advanced surgical supplies required for complex internal injuries. Working in absolute darkness except for brief moments with a heavily shielded flashlight, Sarah gathered medical supplies with the systematic efficiency of someone whose training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. She prioritized medications that would have the greatest impact on her most critically injured patients, but also gathered basic supplies that would allow her to treat additional casualties if the fighting continued. The total weight of supplies approached the maximum that she could carry while maintaining the speed and mobility necessary for escape. The return journey began just as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, creating an urgent need for speed that conflicted with the requirement for stealth. Sarah moved as quickly as she dared through terrain that was becoming increasingly familiar, but the weight of medical supplies slowed her progress, and the approaching daylight would soon eliminate her concealment advantage. Enemy activity was increasing as their forces prepared for what appeared to be a major offensive operation scheduled to begin at sunrise. The most dangerous moment of the entire mission came as Sarah was crossing the exposed section of the second ridge line. Dawn was breaking as she reached the halfway point, and the growing light made concealment increasingly difficult. An enemy patrol appeared unexpectedly on the ridge above her position, forcing her to take cover in a shallow depression that provided minimal protection. For 20 minutes she lay motionless, while armed fighters moved back and forth directly above her hiding place, close enough that she could hear their conversations about the planned attack on American positions. When the patrol finally moved away, Sarah found herself in a race against time that would determine the fate of everyone involved. Daylight was increasing rapidly, enemy forces were mobilizing for their assault, and her wounded Marines were running out of time. She abandoned all pretense of stealth and moved as quickly as possible across terrain that was becoming increasingly dangerous with each passing minute. The sound of heavy gunfire erupted in the distance just as Sarah reached the final approach to Bravo Company's defensive positions. The enemy assault had begun earlier than expected, and she could see muzzle flashes and explosions lighting up the ridge where her fellow Marines were fighting for their lives. The attack was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, indicating that enemy forces had surrounded the American positions completely while she was away. Sarah's arrival at the defensive perimeter came in the middle of the most intense fighting that Bravo Company had experienced since the engagement began. Enemy forces were attacking in coordinated waves, using mortars and heavy machine guns to suppress American defensive positions, while assault teams moved to exploit any weaknesses in the Marine lines. The defensive positions were holding, but barely, and casualties were mounting rapidly among Marines who were already exhausted from 2 days of continuous combat. The medical supplies that Sarah had risked everything to acquire proved to be exactly what was needed to save lives that would otherwise have been lost. Johnson received powerful antibiotics that halted his infection within hours and began the process of recovery that would eventually allow him to return home to his newborn daughter. Martinez was treated with drugs that reduced the pressure on his brain and stabilized his condition until proper neurosurgical care became available. Thompson's internal bleeding was controlled using advanced surgical techniques that were only possible with the specialized equipment Sarah had obtained. Working through the third day of fighting while enemy forces continued their assault, Sarah treated 37 casualties using the medical supplies she had acquired during her unauthorized mission. The antibiotics, surgical equipment, and specialized medications allowed her to provide a level of medical care that was far beyond what should have been possible under field conditions. Marines who would have died from treatable injuries survived to fight another day and eventually return home to their families. The rescue operation that finally broke through enemy lines arrived 72 hours after the initial engagement, exactly as Higher Headquarters had promised. Attack helicopters and ground forces working together systematically destroyed enemy positions that had held Bravo Company trapped for 3 days. The coordination required for such an operation took time to organize and execute, but when it came, it was overwhelming and decisive. The aftermath of the engagement brought recognition for heroism that went far beyond what any regulation or manual had ever anticipated. Sarah's unauthorized mission to acquire enemy medical supplies had violated multiple orders and regulations, but it had also saved the lives of Marines who would not have survived using conventional medical procedures. The investigation that followed her actions concluded that while her methods were unorthodox and technically unauthorized, her decisions had been justified by the extraordinary circumstances and the results achieved. Captain Rodriguez's recommendation for Sarah to receive the Silver Star, the nation's third highest decoration for valor in combat, was approved without debate. The citation read, in part, that Corporal Mitchell had displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, and had risked her life above and beyond the call of duty to save the lives of fellow Marines. What the citation could not adequately capture was the moral courage required to make decisions that went against everything she had been taught about following orders and staying within authorized boundaries. The broader impact of Sarah's actions extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Her willingness to cross lines that others had not dared to approach demonstrated a level of commitment to her fellow Marines that redefined what it meant to be a military medical professional. The techniques she had developed during the engagement, combining field medicine with improvised surgical procedures, became part of advanced combat medical training for future military medics. The Marines of Bravo Company returned home to families who would never fully understand what had happened on that mountain ridge in Afghanistan. Johnson's daughter would grow up hearing stories about her father's service but would never know how close she came to growing up without him. Martinez's wife would notice the scar on his head but would never realize that her husband's survival had depended on a young medic's decision to risk everything for people she barely knew. Thompson's mother would receive a medal in recognition of her son's heroism, but would never learn that his life had been saved by medical supplies acquired through methods that violated every regulation in the military medical handbook. For Sarah, the recognition and medals could never adequately acknowledge the weight of decisions that had defined 3 days when everything that mattered hung in the balance. She had learned that being a medic meant more than following protocols and procedures. Sometimes it meant having the courage to cross lines that others couldn't see, to make choices that went against everything she had been taught, and to risk everything for people whose lives had been placed in her hands. In the end, she had discovered that the greatest acts of heroism often require breaking the rules that were written by people who had never faced impossible choices in impossible situations.